More recently, when debating with Joe Rogan, Phil Plait was forced to comment on the Apollo 1 fire and the lemon that Grissom hung on the spacecraft.
One big problem with Apollo moon hoax conspiracy theories is that a lot of stuff is stated as absolute fact, when in fact it isn't. For example...
Well, it is an absolute fact that he put a lemon on a hanger and hung it over the lemon, and it's an absolute fact that he burned to death in that very lemon.
He did hang a lemon on. That was because of communications issues they were having.
He was saying this thing wasn't going to work. No.
Hang on.
He's been quoted many times as saying that the whole problem, the whole program's in jeopardy, and he didn't think it was going to work. He thought the thing was a lemon.
He didn't think the whole thing was a lemon. He was having certain issues with some of the subsystems.
If he was just having issues with subsystems, why would he publicly put a lemon on a hanger and hang it on the lunar module? That is a monstrous statement from the #1 astronaut in the country.
Yeah, Gus Grissom was a pain in the butt to a lot lot of He was a loud guy, very forceful personality.
That sounds like the kind of guy I would kill.
And
if I was running things,
okay, put the EF5 word is probably better.
If I was running things,
they were doing some tests, and the communication systems weren't working right because these guys were working day in and day out, and it wasn't working right. And he got really frustrated, and he hung a lemon in there, and he was actually yelling something about how are we supposed to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings?
Right now,
the exact quote that Plait is referring to is Grissom's famous, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings?" To simplify, what Plait is saying is that angered over the communication problems he faced when he made that statement, Grissom then went and hung a lemon on the capsule.
God damn, if I can't talk to you 5 miles away, how am I going to contact you from the moon?
They were doing some tests, and the communication systems weren't working right because these guys were working day in and day out, and it wasn't working right. And he got really frustrated, and he hung a lemon in there, and he was actually yelling something about how are we supposed to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings?
Now let's play the audio communications from the Apollo 1 spacecraft and see if that's actually the way it happened.
Hey, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings? I can't hear a thing you're saying. Jesus Christ. Again? But how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?
And the communication systems weren't working right because these guys were working day in and day out, and it wasn't working right. And he got really frustrated, and he hung a lemon in there, and he was actually yelling something about how are we supposed to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings?
Clearly, Plait is not being truthful in his story. The lemon incident happened well before the communication problems. How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings were Grissom's last recorded words? Plait should know that. After all, it was made clear in the Fox special he reviewed.
On January 27, 1967, 2 years before the first moon landing, Grissom and his crew boarded the Apollo 1 capsule for a full-scale simulation. The problems began almost immediately. First, the capsule's communication systems failed.
You copy? No, I didn't read you, Chuck, at all. I can't read you, Chuck. You want to try the phone? How do I get the moon? We can't talk between 3 buildings. I can't hear a thing you're saying.
Suddenly, the capsule burst into flames with the astronauts sealed inside.
They were doing some tests, and the communication systems weren't working right because these guys were working day in and day out. It wasn't working right, and he got really frustrated, and he hung a lemon in there, and he was actually yelling something about, how are we supposed to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 buildings?
Tragically, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives before ever leaving the launch pad.
You got a capsule that's been cranked up to about 20 psi pure oxygen.
Yeah?
You ready?
Yes.
All of them couldn't decide exactly what pressure was in there. Of course, somebody punked the switch. You know what happens when you throw a switch? You get an inductive arc. You know that, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, that inductive arc on bakelite in an oxygen atmosphere is an arc is plasma. Nobody knows the temperature inside of an arc. Did you know that?
That's news to me.
It's all guesswork. G-U-E-S-S work. So that little spark in a bakelite thing, which ordinarily you don't want to burn, would have been enough to set that cooking. The instant you get a little tiny fire, the oxygen force feeds it, and what do you have? You have a total disaster within a second.
Bad leader, get in there and help him. Bad leader, CFCC. Best, can you read it? Can you get him out of this?
The bastards left all the flammable shit behind the seat. They had that capsule loaded with all kinds of glue and fabrics. They cranked the oxygen pressure up to somewhere about 20 pounds positive. See, they're on a pure oxygen thing in there. Well, 20 pounds of pure oxygen is going to kill you anyway, just about, if you're under it too long. And, you make explosion-proof switches for any place that may have gases in it. Well, oxygen is a gas, but they didn't use explosion-proof switches in that ship. They murdered him.
To recap on everything we have established, North American Aviation had known of the fire risk as early as 1964 and then falsely claimed that they thought NASA was doing the test at only 5 psi. NASA had compiled a report in 1964 documenting known oxygen fires at Navy and Air Force bases. These fires had illustrated, in concrete fashion, the potential dangers of 100% pure oxygen atmospheres.
Grissom brought it up initially about there being too much Velcro and too much other stuff around.
Grissom was concerned about how much Velcro was in the spacecraft, and North American Aviation never removed it. NASA knew the wiring in the spacecraft was in bad condition and would fire anyone who dared bring it to attention.
And the wires were really bad in there. I'd ask Gus. I said, Gus, why don't you say something about this wiring? I said, this is really terrible. I ought to do something about this wiring. It's really bad. And he said, I don't. And he said, I can't say anything about it or they'll fire me. That's what he told me. Couldn't believe it.
The fire extinguishers were pulled from the spacecraft and the wires were stripped of their Teflon. Various pieces of equipment were untested and uncertified before they were installed inside the capsule. Grissom was so mad that he took out his anger by hanging a lemon on the spacecraft, something that both Jay Windley and Jim Lovell deny. And of course, the hatch they put on the vehicle could only be opened from the outside.
Hey, how are we gonna get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings?
As we just saw, according to the official communications, from the first mention of fire to the point the capsule ruptured, only 15 seconds went by. During his testimony to Congress, Frank Borman stated that in order to save the crew, the hatch would need to open outward in 2 seconds. Earlier, in Gordon Cooper's Leap of Faith, we are told that the new Apollo hatch, which could be opened in 20 seconds, would probably have saved the crew. What good would a hatch that opens in 20 seconds do if they only had 15 seconds to get out? Or did the crew have more time on their side than we were told? During his testimony, Thomas Ronald Barron made a far more damaging revelation. After the fire, Barron had met with a North American Aviation employee by the name of Al Holmberg. Holmberg told Barron the astronauts had reported fire a good 10 to 12 minutes earlier, and that the astronauts had tried to get out for 5 minutes. Congress immediately tried to shoot down Barron's credibility for bringing this to attention. They even went as far as criticizing him for misspelling Deke Sladen's surname. Almost immediately after his testimony, Al Holmberg himself was brought in for questioning, and promptly denied talking to Barron. Here a curious thing happens. As Bill Casing noted, Holmberg's reasons for being there changes throughout his testimony. At first, Holmberg states that he came at his own free will. But then he claims the only reason he turned up was he worked outside and it was time for him to go to work. Then finally, Robert Smart, the assistant to the president of North American Aviation, comes forth and does the talking for him, stating that he sent one of his employees to go and find Mr. Holmberg. Curiously, although denying he told Barron about the early cries of fire, and just before Robert Smart steps in to do the talking for him, Al Holmberg said this when answering to a question regarding his meeting with Barron. "I bumped into him accidentally almost every time I met him. I told him I shouldn't even be talking to him because of the report he is writing, and he is probably being watched." A week after Barron testified, he was found dead along with his wife and stepdaughter when their car was crushed by a train. Even though Florida law insists that the bodies be autopsied, Barron was promptly cremated after the incident. In any case, although Congress disputed Barron's claims, his reports of the astronauts smelling smoke or fire are deemed factual on NASA's website. They identify Roger Chaffee as the astronaut who smelled fire. Other sources include books by Frank Borman and Peter Bond, and also the newspapers printed at the time. However, these sources log Chaffee's cries as being made at 6:31 p.m, the time the fire broke out, not 10 to 12 minutes earlier as Barron testified. These cries were absent in the communications available from spacecraft films. When this discrepancy was brought up in an online forum, Mark Gray of Spacecraft Films denied that these cries of smelling smoke or fire existed. Somehow, I don't trust him. As was evident in his Apollo 10 DVD set, Mark Gray likes to censor portions from existing NASA flight footage and then sell them to the consumer as uncut. This will become important a bit later. It seems we have two possible times for the first mention of fire. It was either at 6:31 PM, as officially stated, or 10 to 12 minutes earlier, as reported by Barron.